How do we experience more of God's favor in our lives? That's the question we're going to be asking today, and welcome to another Today Matters. My name is Zach Wilbur. I'm the high school pastor here at Skyline, and this is a question that we have been asking a little bit in our high school ministry, and we've been going through this book with our leadership called the Top 10 Leadership Conversations in Scripture. A couple of weeks ago, this was the question. It was, how do we position ourselves for more of God's favor in our lives? And to answer that question, you really have to ask the first one, what is God's favor? And what is God's favor in our lives? Well, God's favor, and this is from Charles Stanley, it's approval, it's His acceptance, it's His joy, His support, His provision. And really, if you want to know, do you have it in your life? It's ask yourself these questions. Do you feel like God is guiding your life and speaking to you? Are you seeing opportunities and doors open and some closed? It's this tangible evidence of God moving in your life. And we read it throughout Scripture all the time. As you read, you can read about God with the Israelites, leading them out of Egypt, right? And it says that they were favorably disposed in the eyes of Pharaoh and things like that. You can read about Ezra and Nehemiah and the favor God gave them with kings. You can read about Ruth getting favor in the eyes of Boaz. This is a term that comes up over and over. And if you're anything like me, when you read Scripture, I read some of these stories, I'm like, God, I want to see you move and open doors that need to be opened and close doors that need to be closed. I want to experience more of your favor in my life and experience it like I'm reading it in here. And so today, I want to read you this story from Genesis 39, and this is about Joseph and his life. And throughout all of Scripture, his life is very evident to me of seeing God have favor on somebody. Because outside of God's favor, I don't know how else you would explain somebody going from being sold into slavery and left to die from his brothers to being in charge of the whole land of Egypt, and the one that ultimately is the one that saves his people in the end. And so Joseph, after he gets sold into slavery, this is what it says in Genesis chapter 39. Verse 3, when his master, and this is Potiphar, saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. And God just had this favor on his life. And you can read, and we were about to read in a second, but Potiphar noticed it right away that this guy has some favor on his life. And I think that there are three keys we can read from this story with Joseph that are things that we can implement in our lives to experience more of God's favor and to position ourselves for more of God's favor. Now, as I say this, there's no magic formula to say, if you do this, you will see God move exactly like we read in Scripture. There's no magic formula because Scripture is also clear. We can't put God to the test. But I do think there are some principles that we can get from this story that we can put ourselves in position to experience more of God's tangible support and approval and acceptance and provision in our life. So this first one, right, he sees that there's this mark on his life, but Potiphar's wife did not have the same opinion of Joseph. In fact, she wanted him to engage in a relationship with her that would be extramarital and that would hurt the influence that God had in his life. Now, Potiphar was not aware of this at the time, but this is what Joseph says after he gets rid of the advances and says no to this. This is what he says. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, and he's talking to Potiphar's wife, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And if you know the story, it goes on to say that she ends up giving this false report of what happened with Joseph. Joseph is thrown in prison, and what happens there? He becomes in charge of the whole prison. Why? Because God blessed him. And part of what we read in this story is, number one, he sought purity, right? And his life was, you can read it right there, it says, how could I do such a wicked thing against God? And I think a lot of times God is looking for us and seeing, what will you do with the small thing so I can give you more? And some people, you want to experience more of God's provision, more of God's tangible evidence in your life, but are you being obedient with what God is giving you right now? The first key, if maybe you want to position yourself for more favor and see God move more in your life, is what does purity look like in your life? Are you seeking it? Is it something that you are trying to live a godly life? Are in the small moments, are you choosing to follow Him and have integrity? Second one is to work in capacity. We read it at the beginning, but Potiphar noticed right away, this guy is really good at what he does. And he says it when he's talking to Potiphar's wife, he's like, he's withheld nothing from me and everything has prospered. One thing that you can do is work on what you can be better at right now. What are the things in the positions that you have, in the relationships that you have? What can you do to increase your capacity? Because the more capacity you have, the more God can give you. And the last one is humility. Joseph, right, he is responsible for so much that is going on in this man's house. There's so much blessing that's coming this way because of the life that he's chosen to live. And you read it right here. He says, how could I do such a wicked thing? I couldn't do this to my master. I couldn't do this to God. And I think when you'll walk humbly with God, when you will walk purely with him, and when you will work on your capacity, that is how you will position yourself to experience more of God's provision in your life, more of God's favor, and to see him open doors that only he can open and close doors that only he can shut. Because all of us, we want to live a life that matters. We want to make today matter. And I think these are 3 keys that you can do to see more favor of God in your life.